So, as I say, I'm excited about this evening, and I was kind of reflecting really a bit on data journalism, data visualization, the kind of things that we're interested in, and how we might go about kind of categorizing some of the stories and some of the things that we think about when we think about data. And I guess the best I came up with was kind of long-term things, medium-term things, and quite short-term things. And so, looking at the past year and things that have happened, the long-term thing, of course, is climate change and the climate crisis, which has a story that takes us way back in time, but also into the future. And the narrative doesn't always change in a sense of the kind of the big picture, but in the kind of the shorter term, the kind of immediacy of some of the stories that may evolve. And, I was thinking of this summer in particular, and a graphic we did this time last year for a book called Atlas of the Invisible, where we show we contrast the 1976 heat wave, which is it become infamous as a defense of climate deniers everywhere, saying that it was hot in 1976 in the British summer, so any subsequent heat wave is just a repeat of that. But what we try and show, of course, is that in 76 it's a blue planet, cooler than it is today, and heat waves in the last 5 or so years have been kind of punctuating an already warming planet. And so, of course, over the summer, we had the unprecedented heat and drought across Europe, which, of course, led to lots of data stories around climate change, and so on. There was a lot of excitement about COP26, I think, and now a bit of disappointment around COP27. But a slight shift, I think, which is interesting, away from the 1.5 degree limit, but towards reparations and compensation for parts of the world that are going to be heavily impacted by the climate crisis. And so telling data stories, again, this is a kind of a map that we collaborated on with the New York Times, where we were showing the inundation risk of the capital of the Marshall Islands. And so basically, if you wipe out a nation's capital, you essentially wipe out a nation. And so telling that story and why it's important in the context of climate, I think, is an important transition. Of course, events in Ukraine have been really important, and I think they've shifted. There was an immediacy of the invasion, but then I think this has become a medium-term story that isn't going to go away anytime soon. And I picked this example because I think it's a really nice example of how we can innovate in the way that we use visual language to tell stories, particularly important stories such as this. And I've got a slight vested interest here because I kind of claim some credit, I suppose, for starting the conversation around how we might depict things like refugee movement. So the map here from the BBC was one of the early maps that was produced and used the standard way of showing population movement, really, which is these big arrows of refugees moving from Ukraine. My argument, and the argument of many others, has been, well, this is the kind of stuff we use to show invasions and things. There's another way we can show that. And I was, really excited to see some of the innovations. One from the FT in the top right here, switching out the arrowheads for those proportional circles, and then Alex and his team at The Economist walking us through on their chart newsletter, actually walking us through the kind of innovation process on how they came up with their different way of visualizing this. And I thought that was really interesting and exciting, and a kind of a thin silver lining for some of these circumstances is it does drive innovation in the way that we can visualize the world. And here's a chart I nicked from Ben, who's going to be speaking straight after me on political polling, and of course, this is in some sense a long-term thing. Now, there's always been politics, but actually the way that it's articulated, the way we think about it, is always is a very immediacy of is a real immediacy to it, the 24-hour news cycle. And of course, arguably, the last 6 months have been kind of almost a couple of decades worth of action packed in, has had almost a couple of decades worth of action packed into them. So the kind of excitement, I suppose, of day-to-day politics as articulated through data is something that's really interesting. And without kind of trying to sound too gloomy, I look back at a graphic we made last year, or a couple of years ago, about the doomsday clock. So the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists issue a prediction of how close we are to doomsday through human action, right? And the closer you are to midnight, the worse things get. So in 2020, they picked us at 100 seconds to midnight, way in excess of where things were in the worst parts of the Cold War in 84, where they said that we were 3 minutes to midnight. So climate change has replaced nuclear proliferation as the big issue there. And actually they stuck us at 100 seconds in 2021. So I thought, well, you know, how are things looking after 2022? Depending on your point of view, it's either good news or more bad news. So they said things haven't got any worse. So we're still 100 seconds even with Putin's invasion of Ukraine, but that's really because they kind of costed in some of these geopolitical instabilities to their predictions, and they still see climate as the big challenge that we face. And so without trying to think, you know, trying to be too grand about this stuff, you know, we turn to charts and graphics and maps and data for reassurance, for understanding, to articulate problems, to conceptualize them, you know, and data storytelling has become a huge and really big part of this. And I often think back, there was a paper written by a chap named John K. Wright in 1942, and it's called Map Makers Are Human. And it's all about how map makers during the Second World War and that crisis, you know, made mistakes, but how you can interpret what they're doing and so on. And he says here that maps help to inform public opinion and build public morale. When the war is over, they'll contribute to shaping the thought and action of those responsible for the reconstruction of a shattered world. And actually, you know, we're not at that, you know, crisis point where we, you know, in the middle of a world war, but we are dealing with some really big challenges, and particularly going forward, they'll continue to be there. And so many of our speakers this evening are in positions where they are doing exactly these things in the maps and the graphics they're creating. And, you know, I think it'll be really interesting to see their perspectives from that. So that's what I'm excited about tonight. That's why I'm excited to hear from Ben, who's up first, who's going to be talking about his work at New Statesman and political polling. Then we're going to move on to Olivia from The Economist, who's been mining Spotify data to tell us something about the English language. And then we have Sam, Alexander, and Dan from the FT talking about their work in storytelling around Ukraine. So Ben and Olivia are up first, and then we'll have a short interval where you can grab a drink and then come back for the FT talk after that. So that's all from me until the panel discussion, where we'll tie off some loose ends, we'll look to the future, and hopefully we'll get some more audience input from you as well. So thanks again for coming, and I'll hand over to Ben.